Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm actually not at FSI anymore, but I'm happy to include the Stephen Hawking Center here. That's something that has been in the works for a long time, and thanks to partnership with Space Florida and the Hawking Foundation, the Hawking family, we now have the Center for Research and Education in Microgravity here at UCF, named after Stephen Hawking. My area of research, I'm in the physics department, my area of research is in planetary sciences. What is planetary science? It's an interdisciplinary field that sort of came into being in the 50s and 60s with the explosion of data about planets in our own solar system from spacecraft exploring those objects directly. Just to give you a reference point, in NASA, the Planetary Science Division, which funds scientific investigations in planetary science, their last fiscal year funding was $2.7 billion. So it's a very significant investment. If you think about that's, about a third of the total NSF budget, and it's just directed at planetary sciences. I've been chair of the department for about a year now. But the research areas that I am keeping active fall into two categories. I'm going to sort of try to link them together today. One is doing microgravity experiments on granular materials and planetary environments, and the other is understanding planetary rings, and in particular the rings of Saturn, with data from the Cassini mission, which orbited Saturn for about 13 years. And ended a few years ago. So what are granular materials? They're ubiquitous in planetary environments. So if you think about these iconic pictures from the surface of the moon that you see at the top here, a footprint in the very fine regolith, that's just the term for the loose material on the surface of a planetary object. In the absence of an atmosphere or weathering, you get this pulverized surface from micrometeoroid and meteoroid bombardments on the surface. And you can see that on that Apollo rover shot, that dust is being kicked up by the wheels and flying everywhere. And you just heard in the previous talk about a return to the moon this decade with astronauts. There's a lot of interest in understanding how that dust behaves and how to mitigate the effects of it. The Apollo astronauts on the last Apollo mission reported that they really could not have made another EVA if it had been in their timeline, because their suits and all the seals were so contaminated by this fine, very abrasive lunar dust that it was jamming things up and making life very difficult for them. On the other sort of less applied side of things is the question of how do planets form? And the rotating object you see there is the asteroid Ryugu. It's less than a kilometer across, and it's basically a very loosely bound pile of rubble. The gravity on the surface of that object is very, very weak. You would not notice it if you were there. So all those rocks and pebbles are very, very loosely bound to the surface. And an asteroid is sort of a leftover building block from the formation of the solar system. So we want to understand what happens when these things are assembled. How do they assemble and get large enough so that gravity helps them to accrete into a larger object? So on the left is just an artist's representation of a circumstellar disk with the dust that is colliding and sticking together to form larger and larger objects. And when they get to the size of maybe 10 or 50 kilometers, gravity starts to play an important role in letting those things grow into planets. But at the smaller realms, it's all handled by surface forces. And on the right, you see the sampling of another asteroid, a small asteroid, Bennu. Looks very much like the asteroid that I was just showing on the previous slide. And what you're seeing here is a series of images taken by the OSIRIS-REx mission. Maybe it's been 2 years now. I'm losing track of time in the COVID era, but within the last year or two, it performed this sampling maneuver And it looks very violent. You see all sorts of materials splashing off the surface and creating this big cloud of debris, but it was actually a very, very gentle maneuver. It came down very slowly, about a meter per second or so, made contact with the surface and just blew a little puff of nitrogen gas into the surface. But because the gravity is essentially zero, that knocks all of these particles up. So the research that we do is trying to understand how these granular surfaces, how these regolith-covered surfaces in various planetary environments behave in response to various perturbations. And that could be a spacecraft sampling it, or it could be an astronaut driving a rover around on the surface of it. So on the left, we have in our lab here a very small laboratory scale drop tower. The experiment you're seeing there, that little video, is at slow motion, but it was taken in the lab with an impact experiment in free fall. And then at the end, you see it collapsing down there. We only get about 3/4 of a second of microgravity in a laboratory scale drop tower. We're hoping to build a bigger drop tower where we can also simulate lunar gravity. But for the moment, if we want to have lunar gravity, we have to go on a parabolic airplane flight. So that you could hear us maybe exclaiming beautiful because it worked. Doesn't look super exciting, but that was an experiment done on the so-called Vomit Comet when it was flying a parabola targeted at lunar gravity. So 1/6 of a G sitting on the floor there, and you get about 10 seconds or so of that, or you can get about 10 seconds of microgravity in those flights. If you want a longer period of time, we need to go suborbital at least. And so we've done experiments on suborbital rockets such as the Blue Origin. In fact, we were the first payload on Blue Origin. So I'll just let this experiment play here. This is not in slow motion. So that impact was at about 30 centimeters per second. That's a lot slower than you could do for some sort of macroscopic scale impact like this in a ground-based lab. Jerking around because their capsule was doing some attitude adjustment maneuvers. But the exciting thing for us in the context of planet formation is you can see that something stuck to something else. And in the absence of gravity, that's an exciting experimental outcome. Call this a mass transfer event. So that's just an example of some of these so-called dirtball fights in space that we're doing to understand the behavior of regolith in planetary environments. And how do I link that to Saturn's rings? Well, Saturn's rings are a big disk like that artist depiction that I showed a couple of slides ago of a system of planets forming around a star. In planetary rings, it's a bunch of small centimeter to meter scale icy particles orbiting a planet. And the image on the bottom here shows some odd disturbance in the rings that we know is due to a larger object in the rings, maybe a few hundred meters across. And we analyze in my research group stellar occultation data, where we see signatures that we are also able to relate to the presence of unusual large objects within the ring system, which indicates that there's accretion going on there, like you would see in the early stages of planet formation, in spite of the very strong tidal forces in Saturn's rings that are inhibiting accretion in general. So we're now looking forward to building a new drop tower facility that we can do lunar gravity or Martian gravity experiments in. So if you are interested in testing some technology that might operate on the moon, we hope to be able to get 1.5 seconds of lunar G in that new drop tower. And we are have ongoing projects to build experiments for technology advancement, as well as basic scientific research on parabolic airplane and suborbital flights, and analyzing data from Cassini. And I always like to show this picture of Saturn's rings from Cassini, and you may not be able to see it. The tip of that arrow is a little pale blue dot, which is the Earth seen from about 1 billion miles. And finally, this is a small experiment showing these different sort of granular material experiment. This was on the space station, the little particles colliding with each other. This is not slow motion, it's real time. And we analyze the aggregation of particles based on their type and understand how coagulation occurs in those space environments. So this research has been supported by NASA and NSF, and of course grateful to the Hawking Foundation and Space Florida, which helped set up that center. Dan Britt, Addie Dove, and Julie Brisset at FSI are among many of the colleagues working on this with me, as well as many students. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.